Welcome to Special Interview. My name is Manuel Rapalo. Joining us today is author of America's Failure in Iraq, Mr. Michael O'Brien. You can also find him on americasfailureinairaq.com. Mr. O'Brien, thank you so much for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here, sir.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to be talking about Afghanistan and Iraq, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, actually right before we jump in, a little bit about your background in the Department of Defense, or Department of State, was it?
Department of State. I was a political appointee in the administration of George W. Bush. I worked on his campaign in 2000, and I was an appointee, as I said, at the State Department and overseas building operations. Actually, my profession is commercial real estate, construction, development, and all that. So I worked at the State Department for a year, and I was in Dhaka, Bangladesh on 9/11. Interesting time, to say the least. And a few months later, I was asked if I'd be willing to join, the team being put together by Governor Tom Ridge, who had been asked by the president to come down from Pennsylvania, where he was the governor at the time, and start up the Office of Homeland Security, which is the predecessor to the new Department of Homeland Security. So I did that, and then left the administration after that. And about in 2006, I went over to Iraq as an advisor. I was the real estate advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Defense.
Oh, okay, so let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about recent developments in Afghanistan. We'll move back to Iraq. I know that's, and I want to talk a little bit about the book as well.
Okay.
But we're seeing the first of the 10,000 troops, the first of the 30,000 surge troops starting to leave Afghanistan, the first of the 10,000 that are expected to be out before the end of the year. That's assuming that we're going to meet that 2011 deadline. What does that mean? It's 10 years in. Does that mean that the United States is leaving? Are we really seeing the pullout?
Well, I'm going to say things that may sound cynical to some, okay? And this is one of them. I equate the withdrawal, first of all, Barack Obama during his campaign said, I will end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, okay? And I believe he said that as a campaign promise, to get elected president, which was the goal. That was the prize. I also believe that after he became the president, he was told by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his closest advisors, the Secretary of Defense, it ain't going to be that easy, Mr. President. And then Stanley McChrystal, who I know Stanley McChrystal. He and I graduated from the same high school here in Washington, D.C., and he was a year ahead of me at West Point. I didn't get in right out of high school, so I went a year later. But I know Stan. And when Stan was the commander in Afghanistan, he asked the president for the number fluctuates between like 60 and 80,000 troops. And for at least 3 months, Obama hemmed and hawed and gave him 30. So all that are being withdrawn are 10,000 of the 30 additional that were added back when Stan McChrystal was the commander in Iraq. It still leaves 20 of the 30 that were added. That's not, I mean, that's just like a sale in a store where you arbitrarily raise the price and then turn around and saying we're discounting it 10%. The fact of the matter is that there are not enough troops in Afghanistan. I'm a military guy. I was in the Army for 9 years. More than some, not as many years as others, but the situation in Afghanistan it's like a game of whack-a-mole. Wherever U.S. forces go, the Taliban, the insurgency, they just, like water following the path of least resistance, they just dissolve and go someplace else. The only way to maintain security in an area on a piece of ground is you have to stay there. We don't have enough forces in Afghanistan, or Iraq for that matter, to maintain security all over the country.
Well, let me cut you off real quick. Why then 10 years? It's been 10 years. If we saw the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, it's like you said, we didn't send enough troops in at the beginning, but things were looking good. Things were actually looking good in Afghanistan prior to 2003. What happened? What changed that drug that war out for an extra 7 years?
One word: Iraq. After after 9/11, President Bush went to Afghanistan very soon after 9/11. He had a valid reason for going there, and I say that because there's a distinction between the reason for going to Afghanistan, excuse me, and then later, 2 years later, going into Iraq. Personally, I feel we had a very valid reason for going to Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was there, the welcome guests of the Taliban regime. That's where they were. They were operating their worldwide network of terrorism out of Afghanistan. We went in there, and as you said, things were going great. The Taliban was, in a matter of months, the Taliban didn't exist. Al-Qaeda was on the run. Everything was going great. And I equate it to, when you're sick and the doctor gives you medicine and you take the medicine and all of a sudden you feel good. And then you go, well, I don't need this anymore, and you stop taking it. All of a sudden you start feeling bad again. You were feeling good because you were taking the medication. We were doing great in Afghanistan, and then we have this thing in America, well, it's okay, so we can leave. We started to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan instead of maintaining what we had achieved. That was the mistake. And we started siphoning them off to the invasion of Iraq. And it took a few years, took about 3, maybe 4 years, for the Taliban to be reinforced from, Chechnya, Uzbekistan, Central Asia, and from other countries that hate the United States, for them to be reinforced, build up their forces again, and they started picking off Afghanistan people, civilians, American soldiers. Then all of a sudden we find ourselves in like 07 and 08 going right back to where we were before, and now it's so much worse. And the thing about it is, why 10 years? Your question. Why so long?
I don't want to draw a parallel to wars like World War II, but honestly, that was the largest conflict the United States has ever been involved in. And how long was that? 4 years?
Manuel, I'm so glad you said that. That's perfect. The United States was in World War II, I think it was less than 4 years. Less than 4. You know why? Overwhelming force. The Allied forces, America, France, Britain, Australia, we went in with everything we had to bring it to an end. So why is Afghanistan, why is it taking so long? We're just using half measures. We're not going in with overwhelming force, which is a military doctrine as old as warfare itself. Go in with more than what you think you'll need to wrap it up and end it, or pull out. Well, make a decision.
That raises questions on defense spending, and I know I've spoken to a lot of economists and about the issue of how can we continue to afford spending this much money, like the amount of money that the U.S. Government spends on the military, but you get responses like, well, it's fractional when you look at the macroeconomic question of the deficit and the U.S. debt and that sort of thing. It's really, defense spending is fractional. What sort of implications does prolonging a war for 10 years have?
In the beginning of my book, in the introduction, within the first page or two, I hearken back to Dwight Eisenhower's last speech to the American people right before he left office in 1961, in January of 61, and then JFK was sworn in as the president. And he made reference to what we commonly know of as the military-industrial complex. And he talked about it to the American people. He talked to the American people about it, and he kind of warned them. He said, the military-industrial complex, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, be wary of this, because it's going to take on a life of its own. He was afraid of it. And this was a man whose entire career was either the military or as the President of the United States for 8 years. And what is the military-industrial complex? During the Second World War, private industry in the United States was completely geared up to make rifles, bullets, planes, tanks, boats. The war ends. These companies are making So much money, it's beyond belief. Are they just going to pack up and go away now that the war is over? Especially if they're publicly traded.
But
their shareholders want to continue making that profit.
But these wars, World War I, World War II, these were wars that were paid for. First of all, they were paid for by war bonds, and we didn't see that in Afghanistan. We didn't see that in Iraq. It was almost as if, and we'll talk about Iraq, but we went into these wars not even thinking about the cost, as if to say, well, that's secondary. That we'll worry about that later.
Because those wars were deliberate. World War II was a deliberate. There was a plan. They said, and they didn't advertise it on CNN, the FDR and the planners of the war, Churchill, they said, we want to get this war over by a certain date. There was a plan. They waited for 2 years before the invasion of Normandy. And the plan was, we feel, they felt that the war could legitimately be over by a certain date. Yes, there was the atomic bomb. That's another issue. But there was a plan. It was deliberate. You mentioned war bonds. Well, that's a method of payment. You can raise war bonds or you can raise taxes. Money is money. And the wars we're involved in now in Afghanistan and in Iraq, there's no plan. There's no plan. Before we go in, there's no plan, a strategy for how many troops we're going to need. There's no plan for how long it's going to take.
With Afghanistan,
for how long how much it's going to cost.
With Afghanistan, though, do you think there was a plan in the beginning? Do you think there was a plan at the start with Afghanistan?
You mean after 9/11? Mm-hmm. I believe there was a plan. I believe there was a plan because Afghanistan it's like the landscape of the moon. It's sparsely populated. It's very, very mountainous. Our intelligence of where Al-Qaeda and Taliban strongholds were, of course the Taliban was in Kabul, but our intelligence was, after 9/11, after that intelligence failure, our intelligence was right on the money for our invasion of Afghanistan. And look at the results.
But things have changed a lot in Afghanistan. It's 10 years. We went into Iraq. The United States went into Iraq, and now we have a different situation in Afghanistan than what the United States started with. Has that plan changed?
They don't have a plan. There is no plan. What's the plan?
I think the plan now is what we're seeing is the withdrawal and handing over to U.S. troops. And on that note, I'm curious to get your opinion on what happens. We know about the corruption in Karzai, in President Karzai's government, but that special relationship between Karzai and the United States, that's not going to last forever. His term's eventually going to be up. How is the relationship with a new Afghanistan regime going to change once the United States is out, if the United States is out?
It's not going to change. It's because of the Afghanistan culture. It is a third world country. They are, no offense to the Afghan people, but they're in the Stone Age by comparison to the way they live, their culture, their norms, their society. They're in the Stone Age compared to the United States. Their economy they have no economy. I mean, my gosh, they ride mules. They're not a very educated people. It's all warlords. It's just warlords. It's like, we have gangs in L.A. They have warlords in Afghanistan. The thing, it comes back to there's no plan. There was never a plan. We went in with a plan to take out the Taliban and take out Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and we did it with CIA operatives, special forces, elite units of Army Rangers, which are more conventional, and Delta teams, Delta Force teams. We went in there and we were doing great, and we siphoned off. We did not maintain the success that we had achieved in Afghanistan. We went into Iraq, which completely just blew up in our faces. Most of it's self-imposed. We went in there because Donald Rumsfeld thought we could invade a country the size of New Jersey with 35,000 soldiers. That was just a pipe dream. It was just absolutely ludicrous.
Let's talk about Iraq then for a second, and we'll move back to something that you touched on regarding President Obama's campaign promise, because that was actually I feel one of the more fundamental things that he said, one of those more fundamental promises that he made during his campaign.